Good evening and welcome to Suffering in Silence with Minister Tia on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We're here every Friday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. Luv Bay family, we're rising out of the ashes together. On this evening, our topic is suicide awareness and prevention. We have with us our co-host, Pastor May Davis of Greater Works Christian Ministries in West Philadelphia. And we also have Stephanie Frant-Antario, Professor of Practice of Psychology at Gwinnett Mercy University. Listeners, if you have any questions or comments for our guest or co-host, you can email us at sufferinginsilencedv@gmail.com. If you have resources that you would like to share with us on a national or local level from your country, your community, your local organizations, or your faith community, you can also email us at sufferinginsilencedv@gmail.com. And we're going to start with Stephanie. If you would introduce yourself to our listeners first and let them know who you are.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's evening here, but good day to you wherever you are. Tia, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Luv Bay Afrobeat Music for having me this evening. My name is Stephanie Frant-Antario, and as Tia said, I am a professor of practice at Gwinnett Mercy University, a small Catholic liberal arts institution just outside of the Philadelphia area. And I'm also a licensed professional counselor in the state of Pennsylvania and actively in practice as an outpatient therapist in addition to my teaching role. And this is a particular area of interest and research and a real call to mercy and action for me. So thank you very much for having me this evening.
Thank you for being here. Pastor May, you want to greet our listeners on this evening?
Hello. Y'all got to forgive me for about 2 minutes tardiness. I was cooking ribs, okay? Cooking ribs for our men's fellowship on tomorrow for my husband, who is the pastor and overseer of Greater Works Christian Ministry, and he's preparing to have a fellowship on tomorrow. And we pastor together, Greater Works Christian Ministries, and I'm excited about being on here. I'm so glad that she kind of like, okay, I looked at the clock. Oh, what time is it? I got to put this rib to the oven. And so I can get on this show. I got to hear this woman of God tonight talk about our subject on tonight, and I'm excited that you're here, and looking forward to what's going to be said on tonight to help the people that are listening. We all need help.
Yes, we do. It was interesting because on this past Sunday, Minister Marks, my brother in the ministry, when he actually he presided over service Sunday, he preached on Sunday, and his message was dealing with and touched on the issue of suicide. And that was just interesting because he didn't know what our topic was going to be this weekend. And I just thought it was interesting for him to bring that topic up and to just give it attention to detail and, just bring that awareness from that point. So it made me think and feel that, we all together are on the right track, bringing the issue out to the forefront as much as we can in our different venues, be it church, advocacy efforts, wherever we happen to be. So I appreciate Minister Marks for doing that. But on this evening, we want to start with sharing some resources. First, we have the Befrienders Volunteer Action to Prevent Suicide. To find a helpline by country, you can visit their website, which is www.befrienders.org. That's BEFRIENDERS.org. And then we have the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Their website is www.suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Their phone number is 1-800-273-8255. That's the national number for the United States. And then specifically in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we have the suicide hotline. That number is 215-686-4420. So again, listeners, our topic on this evening is suicide awareness and prevention. And I wanted to start by sharing an article that we touched on previously. I wanted to share some of that before we move into our discussion. The title is Suicide by Domestic Violence, Call to Count the Hidden Toll of Women's Lives. This article was written by Yvonne Roberts. This is from February 27th, 2022, The Guardian. 8 months before she took her own life, Abigail Patterson, 29, was brutally assaulted by her partner, Robert Holliday. She had suffered 5 years of violence and on this occasion received a fractured cheekbone, bruising, and a head wound. Holliday was already subject to a suspended sentence for assaulting her, also damaged furniture in her house, and cut up her clothes. In March last year, Judge Mark Berry told Holliday, before sentencing him for assault, causing actual bodily harm and damage to property, that she, Patterson, was left in a lot of pain. She couldn't eat properly and needed help with washing and dressing. She was worn down by you. Judge Berry continued, it is clear the family blamed you for her death and her mental health had deteriorated since the last assault, and they may well be right, but you have not been charged in a way that allows you to be blamed for her death. Holliday was sentenced to 2.5 years. He will be out in half that time. The causes of suicide are complex. Nevertheless, in France, since 2020, if domestic abuse is a prominent factor, the perpetrator can expect a sentence of up to 10 years and a fine of $150,000. No such law exists in the UK. In 2013, Karen Blatchford, unaided, began counting women who had taken their own lives after experiencing male violence, some abused by more than one partner, recording each woman on Twitter at we_r_Nina, not invisible, not alone. Now she is calling for these deaths to be officially counted. The extent of domestic abuse-related suicide and hidden homicides that include, for instance, accidents and femicides that pass as suicides is only now beginning to emerge because of the work of campaigners such as the charity Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse. Clary O'Callahan and Karen Ingala Smith, co-founders of the annual Femicide Census, with whom the Observer has been working on its End Femicide series, advocate that better data is vital. Now a new campaign called #NotJustAnother, mother, sister, daughter, friend, has been launched, founded by criminologist Professor Jane Monckton Smith. In the run-up to the anniversary of Sarah Everett's killing on March 3rd, MPs will receive a letter signed by more than 330 organizations, charities, individuals, and bereaved families. Among its demands is a call for police to treat all sudden, unexpected deaths of those known to be victims of domestic abuse as potential femicide from the outset, securing the scene. A Home Office report published in 2015 looked at 32 unexpected deaths that the police had decided were not suspicious and were subsequently re-examined by forensic pathologists. 10 transpired to be killings, and a further 5 were suspicious and required further investigation, almost 50%. The full extent of domestic abuse-related suicide is unknown, but the little that has been established is chilling. We know enough to know that we should be seriously concerned, says one researcher. In 2004, data from Professor Sylvia Walby estimated that 1 in 8 of all female suicides and suicide attempts in the UK are due to domestic violence and abuse. This equates to 200 women taking their own lives a year, nearly 30 women attempting domestic abuse-related suicide every day. More recently, a Home Office and police study of the first year of the pandemic, April 2020 to March 2021, detailed 38 domestic abuse-related suicides, a likely underestimate as only those with a reported history of abuse to police were included. The majority were aged under 45, and 90% were female. So there's so much that surrounds the issue of suicide awareness and prevention. I really want to start by saying to listeners, it's okay to feel how you feel. And you don't have to keep your feelings to yourself. So with that thought, I think I want to, if we could start by just tearing down the stigma and the shame that often keeps people from coming forward to get help. So Stephanie, I would ask if we could start there, if you would just start on that note, the shame and the stigma that keeps people from coming forward.
Absolutely. I think it's a critical place to begin, and it's a critical thought to keep with us throughout the conversation. We think about risk factors for things like interpersonal violence. We think about risk factors for things like suicidality. And we often look at external factors, right? What's going on in the environment. We look at abusive partners. We look at economic factors, socioeconomic factors, all kinds of factors, mental health, mental illness. I would suggest, Pia, to your point and to the point of the article that you just referenced, that silence is one of the most significant factors that puts people at risk for a death by suicide. We think about the stigma, right? We think about things like cultural script, right? And stigma related to suicidal ideation and suicidality. So every culture, right, has its own scripts related to things like gender and gender roles and life and death, and particularly, right, religion and faith. And the interplay of these cultural scripts, right, there's some message in there for each of us in the culture in which we live about suicide. What is acceptable to talk about? What kinds of feelings are acceptable to have? And who is allowed to have those feelings? Often that is very gendered, right, in a particular culture or related to a particular social status. The invisibility of the risk factors that contribute to suicide is significant. And the silence that is imposed upon people who are struggling with suicidal ideation is significant indeed. And we think about, where does that silence come from, right? What fuels the silence? And it is, just as you said, that stigma. It is blame. It's that blame and shame game, right, that is so often at work also with those who are victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So too are we blaming and shaming people who struggle with suicidal ideation. For listeners in the United States, you may have noticed as of late a real intentional shift in language around suicide. We're starting to hear it more in the media, but certainly a really concerted effort in community health organizations and community mental health organizations, where we are shifting language, right, from a perspective that describes committing suicide, right, and turning that into died by suicide, right? People commit crimes, right? Mm-hmm. And when we use language is so powerful. And when we use the language of commit suicide, we are likening that behavior to a crime. And in fact, it is still a crime in over 20 countries worldwide for a person to attempt to take their own life, or for them to be charged with a crime posthumously because they have died by suicide. Let's sit with that for just a minute and the absurdity of that construct, that we would punish people who are at their most vulnerable, mm-hmm. who are feeling most depleted and most invisible and alone, right? Who are silenced by the shame and stigma and blame that many cultures, right, across the world might implicate a person who's having suicidal ideation. And then add to that in some places it's considered a crime, in many places. And we start to really understand all of the complex factors that come together that silence a person, right, that keep that pain going. We think too about how this idea of cultural scripts, if we stick with that for a minute, how powerful culture is in each of our lives. And, you know, we'll kind of think about culture, big picture culture, all of the different ways that we define ourselves, all of the different communities to which we belong or ascribe, right, and the intersectionality of all of those communities. Each of them has these cultural scripts. And if multiple communities to which we belong or ascribe are sending us messages, intentional or otherwise, that tell us that to have thoughts about suicide is shameful, right, or weak or weak-minded, right, we are much less likely to express our need and to tell another person about what we're experiencing. And that significantly increases risk.
Well, I have never, until you just mentioned it, I did not know in any state whatsoever that suicide was a crime. I did not know that. And I did not know that someone would be charged posthumously after the fact. That makes no sense to me. And as part of the silence, which is because of the shame and stigma. And Pastor May, I would ask you your thought, because I even from a little girl, I remember hearing, suicide being associated with being weak, suicide being associated with being a coward and just not being strong enough to deal with life. I never heard it associated the proper way, that this person is hurting, this person is scared, or this person is emotionally drained for whatever reason. I can go down the list of the points that were made to cause the stigma and the shame, but never a list of what this person needs, why they're going through what they're going through, and then the resources to back that up. So Pastor May, as a pastor, I would ask you, have you, I guess, run into the issue of having to deal with the silence and trying to break down the stigmas on your end with dealing with it from a pastor's point of view?
Well, it's really just meant for the whole conversation, because this past week, on my segment with Tips on Tuesday and Even Women Win Wednesday, and this being Mental Health Month, I dealt with the fact that mental illness a lot of times comes from outside the children. Some of them are born with certain mental illnesses, but mental illnesses stemming from things, trauma, post-traumatic syndromes that took place, be it rape, be it domestic violence, that have triggered depression, trigger oppression, triggers panic attacks, stress, all of these things that now going from that point to a person saying, I can't handle this anymore. And my appeal was to the community, the church community, that you got people sitting in your congregation right now that's experiencing some of these mental illnesses by way of, some of them, you don't even know that they're being abused by their spouse. You don't know that the child is being abused. But as a pastor, once you find out, if you're not capable of counseling and you're not, geared to being able to handle something like that, you need some type of intervention for those people in the church community that are dealing with stress, dealing with domestic violence. One of the things that with Tia coming to us and us helping to deal with the things that she had going through, put us in a place, listen, you haven't gotten help anywhere else, you're going to get help here. Okay? We're going to do our best. If we can't do it ourselves, we're going to find somebody that can help do the needed thing to help you get through this. And the church, to me, doesn't take on that type of priority for people in the church community enough. Maybe some do, but not enough, because the church people have stress. Yeah. There are pastors that, and I meant to do the statistics that on Monday when I talked about this, that there have been pastors who have taken their own life. And these are men of God, supposed to know the word, teach and preach the word, but the life has taken such a toll on them, and that they desire not to live anymore. For whatever stress or whatever that has led them to that they have made a decision. Men that are sitting and teaching and preaching every Sunday, throughout the week, and then everybody is shocked or surprised to find out that pastor took his life and nobody saw the signs. Everybody's so interested in getting what they need and did not look at what the pastor needed. And then here you find out later, the pastor has taken his life. So my stand is that with it being Mental Illness Month, I think churches need to really find intervention ways on how to see the signs. Sometimes there's no signs there, because people learn how to function in their stress, in their oppression. But there are signs. People don't pay enough attention to it. But there are signs that gives indication that someone is in a stressful situation, someone's in a domestic situation, So the church needs to pay more attention to what's going on, so that we can find ways to help, at least giving an ear to someone that's going through that. And then if they can't help as a pastor, find the resources, find the different places that are there to help people that are dealing with these sort of issues, mental issues. And then, sometimes people will tell you, you'll read it on Facebook. My nephew went through that. He poured his heart out on Facebook. And I was like, hold up. This is what I'm reading and listening to on Facebook. There's something wrong here, And all the family got together and we called, because he was in a place that he felt like he wasn't loved. Nobody paid him any attention. He was, everybody looked over him, and he was in a place like, if nobody, loves me, nobody wants to be a part of my life, then I don't want to be a part of theirs anymore, And then, but we all got together as a family, talked with him, what do you need us to do for you? What is that, so we were able to pull him out of that. But that doesn't always happen. What we read was a cry for help. People have their ways of crying out for help before they actually take the act on of suicide. Yeah. But people don't pay enough attention. The church needs to pay attention more than they are now.
Stephanie, can you speak to how suicide actually relates to domestic violence and trauma? There are so many issues that intersect and cross paths with domestic violence, sexual assault, missing and murdered Indigenous women, human trafficking. There are so many different areas that cross through domestic violence. So can you speak to how suicide actually intersects with domestic violence as well?
Yeah, I think the article that you mentioned at the start of the program is a good example of how challenging it can be to disentangle all of these different risk factors, right, and situations that are happening. And we think about how deaths are reported and whether we're looking at something like a forced suicide, femicide, right, or the intentional act of taking one's life, dying by suicide, or making an attempt on one's life. And so we look at all of these vulnerability factors, right? And Pastor May, you're talking about this too. We think about all of these risk factors that might make a person particularly vulnerable to suicide. And we know that trauma, whether we're talking about sort of a single event trauma, like a rape or sexual assault, or chronic trauma, like long-term sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, even trauma in the form of sort of chronic trauma or traumatic circumstances, people who live in, economic poverty, right? People who live in areas where their health and their safety are constantly at risk. So trauma, right, can hold all of these different kinds of life experiences. There isn't enough research for us to really understand, or in my experience, I have not seen enough research to really understand sort of the direct correlation between intimate partner violence and suicide rates in terms of, big picture scope. And certainly internationally, that's really complicated by how we look at relationships and what's permissible in relationships in a variety of cultures, right? We think about traditional roles in relationships. But we do know, right, there are some studies that suggest that those who are victims of intimate partner violence are far more likely to make an attempt on their lives and to make multiple attempts. So once a person has made an initial attempt to die by suicide, it significantly increases their risk of making another attempt. And that seems to be especially a risk factor for those in intimate partner violence or domestic violence situations, right? We see this kind of ongoing long-term vulnerability. Just to take a step back a minute, we think about, how we have been socialized to respond to things like suicidality, and really we've been socialized not to respond, right? Pastor May, to your point, we have been socialized to look away from this complex situation.
Like, don't touch it.
Don't touch it, don't look at it, don't get close to it. If you get close to it, you're going to be responsible for it. It's like, picture how people react when there's a bomb, right? Or a suspicious package in the middle of the road, right? And you don't send a person in, right? We send in robots. We stay as far away from it as we possibly can get. We are socialized in many ways to think of suicidality in this way. Don't look directly at it, right? We might trigger it. Certainly don't speak to it, right? We might trigger it. What happens if we touch it? Certainly we will trigger it. And that socialization could not be more wrong. It is fueled, like many other interactions we have, by fear, by misinformation, and by a lack of understanding. And so certainly we look at risk factors in terms of the life experience of a person that increase the likelihood that they will be victims of domestic violence, interpersonal violence, sexual violence, and even suicidality, right? And trauma is a big part of that. We like to talk a lot about trauma, especially it's the buzzword these days, right, for everybody, but are we any better for all our talking about trauma? We have to ask ourselves whether we are any better or getting more equipped to look at trauma.
Yes.
And to enter the experience of another person who is experiencing trauma or who has survived trauma. We are still, right, if we really get honest with ourselves, most of us are still reluctant to enter that space with one another. It's a really vulnerable place. it can help sometimes for us to think in terms of our own vulnerability. What does it bring up for us when we think about something like domestic or sexual violence, interpersonal violence? What's the visceral reaction that we have in ourselves to that? And the same is true for suicide. What is the visceral reaction that we have, right? What is our natural inclination when we hear about suicide? Is it to move towards, right? Or is it to pull away? And I think most people would say, right, especially if they haven't had the benefit of education or training, it might be to retract. It's also interesting that that is not how we are socialized around other natural human experiences of vulnerability.
Right.
Right? When someone is ill, right? If somebody on your block gets cancer, what does everybody do?
You start cooking food and going to the house and bringing,
cleaning the house.
We start
Right.
cooking. We show up with gloves on. We start cleaning the house, right? We start getting ride shares. Who's getting the kids to where they need to go? How can we help you? How can we lift your spirits? Cards, prayers, right? We think about our faith communities and our local communities and how we move toward, we wrap people in love when they experience natural human frailties and vulnerabilities. In stark contrast, when the human vulnerability or frailty that's being experienced is victimization of violence, right? Or vulnerability to suicide, we do not respond in the same way.
Well, it's interesting. I was actually going to ask you about that. I was going to ask you your thoughts on what keeps people from inviting someone to share. And I know we touched on this a little bit some time ago, but I was going to ask you what keeps people from inviting someone to share. Like what keeps someone, for instance, in Pastor May's situation, what would keep them from reading that information on Facebook, but then they won't reach out. They won't go to their nephew or their sister or whomever and say, hey, do you need anything? And I think, you touched on it with the socialization and our personal reactions to it. But I think that's a real question. What keeps us from inviting someone to unload, because if it's, someone dealing with cancer, we're there. What do you need? I'm there. If your child is sick, I'm there for you. But, and Pastor May, I'll ask you first, for your thoughts as well. Why do we treat it like that bomb we want to sit in the robot for? Instead of putting our own hand on it. Because I honestly believe there are times you can speak to someone, and if you just give them 5 minutes of your time, just 5 minutes, that can make such a huge difference in somebody's life. But we don't want to be, I guess there's a fear of the answers or a fear of what's going to come out of their mouths that we run away from. Why do you, think that is, Pastor May?
Speaking from a pastor's perspective, is that a lot of pastors don't want to get involved. They just don't want to get involved in fear that if something should happen, somebody's going to come to them and then what part did you put? They don't want to have to answer if it goes to the left. They don't want to answer to anything if it relates to somebody that's trying to take the act of suicide as that road out for them. The church doesn't want to address it because they don't want to be responsible for whatever may happen. And I think that's the wrong approach. And I give an example of a young man that I think it's about 10 or 11 came to the church with his cousin. And he's been abused. And he's going to be living with his other cousin because of the situation. He's ran away from home several times, and because of his home situation. And they asked me to pray for him. So what I did was ask the whole family to come forward. I prayed specifically for him. I began to talk to him about, you can, trust, people who love you. It's something to that effect. And I told him, I love you. I'm meeting you for the first time, but I love you. And I think that you're wonderful, And, so we got finished with the prayer. His cousin called me later, and she said, he was so excited about what you said. And she said, I said, what do you mean? He said, that lady that talked about me, that told me that she loved me, I think she really likes me, So this is a 10 or 11-year-old, that, if he's getting abused at this age, 9, 10 years old, the possibility of him wanting to end his life is great. Unless someone begins to tell him how much they love him, how significant he is to the family, and how wonderful and how creative he is. And that one conversation or that one attempt that I made to make him feel that he was loved triggered a whole nother conversation, and he wants to come back, So, you have the church is supposed to love, but sometimes they forget about loving those that are on that level.
Yes.
And we can't, we're responsible to love everybody, no matter what circumstance or situation that they're in. But for there are so many reasons why sometimes pastors and churches don't want to get involved in it. They don't want their name attached to it. If something should happen, then they're going to come back to the church, and they don't want that stigma or that publicity or whatever that may come upon it. We're supposed to be risk takers,
yes.
Okay? As pastors, we got to take a risk. If we're talking about how the Lord took a risk on us, he died for us, and we don't want to take a risk on the people that he has set in our churches to manage and encourage through the Word of God, then you're doing an injustice to your people, because there's so many people sitting in a congregation that are contemplating taking their own life. They're sitting there, they're abused, and they can't go to the pastor. Come on here. There's something wrong with that.
Yes.
That you can't go to your pastor and say, listen, my husband is beating my butt 24/7. Okay? And the pastor, what? And we experienced that when someone came and told us that, I'm being abused. And so you got to sit up and pay attention, because the other part of that too, supposing it's a lie. Supposing they're really not being abused. Okay? And then the pastor or the church acts on it, and then we find out it's not true. And then the pastor, it's the stigma of the pastor or the church getting involved may be a repercussion on the church if they get involved and something doesn't go right with it. But we got to take that risk.
Yes. Because
this might be that at that time, that one person, if you think all the rest of them is not telling the truth, one person might come to you. That might be the one, you think about the cry wolf scenario. Everybody's not crying wolf. These people are hurting if they're in your church and they're hurting and they come to you. It's just crazy, because other people have come to me and my husband and they belong to churches.
Well, that was the case for me. I was not a member of Greater Works at that time, but I not only went to my church home, but I went to several churches within the city of Philadelphia, and I did not get the help that I needed until I came to Greater Works, and I reached out. So I was not a member of Greater Works when I reached out. And so, but I personally know what that's like to go to your church leadership for any issue and not get, the help that you need. And so I think it's it's a shame when you have to reach outside of your own community, be it church or your, your neighborhood or what have you. When you have to reach outside of where you literally are to get help from another place, to me that just adds, well, personally, I know that just adds to the stress, that adds to the hurt, that adds to the humiliation of it all. It makes it worse. Luv Bay, we want to welcome you again to Suffering in Silence with Minister Tia on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We are here with you every Friday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern, with a replay on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern. And Luv Bay, we are continuing to rise out of the ashes together. We want to share with you those resources again. Befrienders volunteer action to prevent suicide. To find a helpline by your country, you can visit their website, www.befrienders.org. And again, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Their website is www.suicidepreventionlifeline.org. And their phone number is 800-273-8255. And again, the suicide hotline number for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is 215-686-4420. So, Stephanie, I wanted to ask you about awareness and prevention efforts, but with the way that I'm thinking about it and looking at it now is that it's two parts. It's for the person who is actually going through the thoughts and the feelings or ideations of suicide, but also for those of us who are around, like what can we do to help, instead of running away, instead of being afraid to take the risk to help. So I think if you could address that, on both sides, the awareness and prevention efforts.
Yeah. So I'd love to follow up to Pastor May's comments about fear, right? And how fear can trap us in this place of inactivity, right? Or a lack of response. And just to remind folks that we have these myths that permeate our cultures about suicide. And that's a significant barrier for us in reaching out, in moving towards, right, and looking at what's happening around us and learning to, right, as Pastor May said, learning to look, learning to listen, really learning to listen. And so some of the myths, I want to just address those up front and just call them out for what they are, which is false, right? Talking about suicide does not plant a seed in someone's mind to take their life or end their life. It does not, right? You can't accidentally burn on someone's attempt, right? Or cause someone to die by suicide accidentally by talking about suicide. That's a myth. It's a myth that people who drop hints about suicide are just seeking attention. That's a myth, right? It's a myth that suicide cannot be prevented, right? So some people are out there like, well, if somebody has that in their mind, there is nothing I can do or say that could make that change. That's a myth. That's false, right? You heard the story that Pastor May just told us about that child. We can make a difference, right? Sometimes a simple point of contact, one point of contact even, can change the trajectory of a person's life. I'll offer for folks, anybody out there who has access to technology, who can look up the story of Kevin Hines, Hines, who is a suicide attempt survivor and speaker. Has a very powerful story. There's a brief video on YouTube you can watch under 10 minutes about his story, and he specifically speaks to that moment when somebody could have intervened simply and did not. And so we have to address the myths. The myths permeate fear, right? And that is the primary driver of people not reaching out and not looking closely and not moving towards someone that they think might be in danger. It is our own vulnerability that causes that fear. We worry, we say to ourselves, what if I say the wrong thing? Mm-hmm. And I'm here to say to you, you can't possibly. As long as you say to a person, I think you're hurting and I care about that, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. As long as you do not dismiss someone's feelings or try to brighten it and silver line it and make it better, as long as you don't ignore what's in front of you, right? If you can meet another person in a moment of genuine contact that recognizes your vulnerability and theirs, even if it is to say, I suspect you're going through something really hard, and I'm not sure if I know how to help, but I am here. Right? If we can move through our own vulnerability to get to a place where we can simply even just be present and know, right, that sometimes is all that's necessary. Sometimes that's most powerful. We can prepare ourselves with knowledge, right? So I advocate for training, for us to train ourselves, right? And we know that the person most likely to hear those thoughts about suicide or to get wind of those hints that somebody's not okay are not necessarily the clinical mental health professionals. Before somebody gets to me, they had to come through both of you, probably, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So it's a loved one, a friend, someone in your faith community, someone in your school, a neighbor. Mm-hmm. Could be a stranger at the grocery store, mm-hmm. who just gets a feeling in their gut like somebody's not okay. And so the better able we are to build capacity in the general population to look for signs of suicide, to listen for risk factors and vulnerability, and that's not enough, though, to act. The more people we can train on how to ask the question and to sit with the answer, mm-hmm. even if the answer is scary, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. The better able we can equip people with resources. I really would encourage everyone listening right now, whether you yourself are at risk, feeling vulnerable, or you know someone else who is, or you think you might someday encounter a person who is, to, if you have access to a cell phone, take out your cell phone and add in the phone number for your local crisis response team so that you always know you have backup if you find yourself in a situation where you have courage enough and compassion enough to reach out in a moment of genuine contact with another person, even though you're scared. Think about how scared they are, right? If you can do that and you have access to resources, you know that you'll know what to do next if the answer comes back yes, right? We have to not be afraid of language. We have to be able to ask people directly, I'm scared for you. I'm feeling worried about you. I'm nervous about the things that I'm hearing. I suspect you might not be okay. Are you thinking of taking your own life? Are you thinking of ending your life? Have you thought about dying by suicide? Right? Being really careful not to use that commit language, right? That blame language, but being able to reach out. And then the number one reason why people don't ask that question, Tia, is because they're afraid that the person will say yes.
Yeah.
That's the number one reason why we don't ask, is because our gut tells us this person is not okay. And what happens if they say yes? Then what? So the more we can equip ourselves with resources, right? Recognizing that most people are not going to have the mental health background to know what to do next, except to sit and be present and say, I'm here with you. I'm here for you. Let me help you get some help. Let's get some help. Before I move on to the person who is vulnerable and experiencing suicidal ideation, I'd like to offer an additional resource to people internationally. This is a resource that will help in addition to the Befrienders website that Tia already mentioned. There's also a website called save.org, SAVE.org, which will help you to find your resources in any country, almost in any municipality. It really will help you get to very close to where you are. in terms of not just hotlines, but also your community crisis response teams. And that might be the phone number that you most need to have in your cell, right, is who to call, who can come on site. Community crisis response teams can come to you wherever you are if you're sitting with someone who's really in danger. And that can help take a lot of pressure off of the person who had the courage to ask that question, and then the compassion to sit with that person when the answer is yes. Right. So we get stronger when we are in community, when we can put that education that we receive into action, when we can create conversations in our communities to help reduce the stigma, the more likely people are to both reach out for help and also reach out to those who need help. Right? And let's not burden people who are already being victimized by violence or who are already feeling oppressed by their own suicidal ideation, right? Let's not put it on them to be the ones who have to reach out and ask for help.
Yes.
Right? Let's gear up with education and resources, and let's be that courageous to be the person in our community who can ask the question. A couple of ways people can get that help in the United States. There are free trainings available all across the U.S. called QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer Training. And often local community health and mental health organizations will sponsor these trainings. You can reach out locally to ask for who does QPR in my area. You can do a Google search. And these are meant for non-mental health professionals. These are meant for laypersons, right, and clergy and anybody, first responders, teachers, right, anyone, neighbors and friends who wants to have a toolkit so that they know how to listen, what to listen for, those risk factors, the hints that people drop, and then the right terminology, how to ask the question, and then what to do if the answer is yes. And so I recommend that. Mental Health First Aid is another program that's often free for community members, which is a day-long program to help us better understand mental health, mental illness, and the space in between, which is where most of us live most of the time, and how we can compassionately care for folks who are having mental health issues and respond appropriately to things like a mental health crisis, so that we don't have violence erupt right in a place where a person is already stressed, and we just don't have the capacity or skills to respond appropriately. So I'll put that out there as an invitation for folks who are thinking they may want more information, and as a charge, right? For those of us who really believe in nonviolence, who want to live nonviolence, we remember that Dr. King and Gandhi and the Quakers and my own Sisters of Mercy call to, have this call to nonviolence, which is just, it's not just the absence of violence, right? It's an action. It's actively seeking peace. And how do we do that in our communities, right? Part of that is really helping to prevent suicide. For those who are in danger themselves, for those who are feeling vulnerable, there are many different mental health supports that can protect and help to build resilience and help to build capacity and coping skills. And so we think about kind of taking stock of resources, internal resources and external resources, right? Being able to think about to whom are we connected, right? To whom are we responsible, right? Marcia Linehan, who is one of the proponents of dialectical behavior therapy, talks about a life worth living. Really actively seeking things that for us have purpose and meaning and value, and then finding courage to use our voice to be able to tell people that we are not okay. And that's the harder position to be in. So I would say we have a responsibility, those of us who are not struggling, to be the hand that reaches out to those who are.
But thank you so much, Stephanie. I appreciate you for being here. Pastor May, I appreciate you being with us. I believe that this is a topic that we definitely should revisit and need to revisit in the future. Luv Bay, if you want to catch up on previous episodes from the program, you can visit our YouTube channel, Suffering in Silence DV. I want to thank you again for joining Suffering in Silence with Minister Tia here on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We are with you every Friday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. Luv Bay family, we are rising out of the ashes together. Now, everyone, please have a safe and a good evening.